decisive when they work together, and they work what I call in a good cop, bad cop manner. The bad cop is the IMF, which enters through its macroeconomic loans and then imposes structural adjustment conditionalities. And most of those conditionalities, apart from liberalizing the economy, have to do with less spending in the social sectors. And the moment that happens, enters the good cop, which is the World Bank, who through social safety net says, oh, you have a problem in education and health, we'll provide you loans in these sectors. And this combination is visible throughout the world, and most visible in 1991 India, that after we contracted for an IMF loan and had to curtail educational spending, the social safety net was offered, was taken up by the Indian government for the first time to fund primary education through the district primary education program. So there is quite apparently in its functioning a certain coherence in the way they operate. But I think this coherence is in their structure itself. And the structure, as outlined quite eloquently by Emmanuel Wallerstein, and I'm going to read that, what is the backdrop of the emergence of the World Bank? And I know there will be a lot of repetition of this because some papers might refer to, but I'm referring to something hopefully different, which is to say that why were they needed? And Wallerstein identifies two initiatives, the Bretton Woods and the Yalta initiatives, as defining the post-Second World War restructuring of the world. So the backdrop to the IMF and World Bank emergence, USA, as we know, emerged from the Second World War as the only major industrial power whose industries were intact and whose territories had not been badly damaged by wartime destruction. US industries had, of course, been perfecting their efficiencies for over a century. This long-term economic development, combined with the literal collapse of the economic structures of the other major low-side production, gave the USA a productivity edge that was enormous, at least for a time, and made it easy for US products to dominate the world market. It made possible, furthermore, the largest expansion of both value and production in the history of the capitalist world economy, creating simultaneously great wealth and great social strain in the world social system. As of 1945, the USA had two major problems. It needed a relatively stable world in which to profit from its economic advantages, and it needed to re-establish some demand on the rest of the world if expected to have customers for its flourishing productive enterprise. In the period 1945-55, the USA was able to solve both these problems without too much difficulty. The problem of world order was resolved in two parts. On one hand, there was the establishment of a set of interstate institutions, notably the UN, the IMF, and the World Bank, all of which the USA was able to control politically and which provided the formal framework of order. And on the other hand, the more important for US at that time came an arrangement with the only other serious military power in the post-1945, the USSR, an arrangement that was at Yalta. Now, essentially, this should provide a background about why amongst the Bretton Woods institutions there was this coherence. And what was at the heart of the Bretton Woods 1944 conference in New Hampshire? It was encouraging open markets. The seminal idea behind the Bretton Woods conference was the notion of open markets. In Henry Morgenthau's farewell remarks at the conference, he stated that the establishment of the IMF and the World Bank marked the end of economic nationalism. This meant countries would maintain their national interests, but trade blocks and economic spheres of influence would no longer be their means. And the second idea behind the Bretton Woods Conference was joint management of the Western political economic order, meaning that the foremost industrial democratic nations must lower barriers to trade and the movement of capital in addition to their responsibility to govern the system. And the Bretton Woods Conference allowed for the synthesis of Britain's desire for full employment and economic stability and the United States' desire for free trade. I'm going to skip about how they were crafted and how the Asian Development Bank came up actually to be crafted and switch over to how is this coherence, which was at the heart of the Bretton Woods, how is it institutionally worked out? What are the institutional mechanisms of coherence in policies? Do remember that there were three children of Bretton Woods: World Bank, IMF, and that also came out of it, which later transformed into WTO. So essentially, how do these three institutionally cohere their policies and then have regional banks, export credit agencies actually towing the line? Greater coherence between the World Bank, IMF, WTO, UN, regional banks, bilateral donors, and others on neoliberal programs and policies has always been the agenda globally. The coherence agenda involves liberalization in goods, services, investment, trade-related capacity building, improving global financial stability through capital account liberalization, and channeling increased investment to developing countries and assisting borrower countries to improve coherence in their national policies. Coherence is therefore not necessarily only between the IFIs, but coherence is sought within the national policies of the borrowing countries. And this is quite important because, unfortunately, yesterday when education was being discussed, what was left out is this coherence and privatization is brought to, in principle, by negating the principle on which most of us have built our national policies, which was to identify areas of human development or human needs, which we call the public good. We live with the notion that water is a public good, that education is a public good, that health is a public good. What's important to note is that it is exactly these areas where we have crafted, the IFIs have crafted laws and covenants which say these sectors are not public goods. To give you one example, somewhat which is tangential to these Bretton Woods institutions, which are the free trade agreements, particularly NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. It's only in NAFTA that you find very clearly stated that, I quote, water in its natural state is a tradable commodity. Now, this is the defining notion for water, which is then used by all financial institutions, including WTO, World Bank, in saying that water as a public good is no longer valid. Water in its natural state is a tradable commodity. So whether it's in a glacier or in a river or a pond, it is by definition of NAFTA a tradable commodity. And this becomes then the coherence for any system of water regimes to be worked out by any of these institutions. The same is true actually, and I wish this was discussed yesterday in education, that we live with the notion that education is a public good. But beginning with Milton Friedman's thesis that education is not a public good, that's at the heart of the structuring of the educational policies of IFIs, that you cannot accept it as a public good, particularly much more than the policies that were discussed yesterday about which are Indian government policies. It is the voucher system which is based on this notion that education must allow parental choice rather than being given as a right. And I think it is these areas where we need to counter really the notions of this coherence of policies that IFIs operate with.